Hi, and welcome to postburnout.com interviews. Postburnout.com is a culture website dedicated to venerating burnt out artists the world over. My name is Aaron Kavanagh and I'm the website's founder and editor-in-chief. This is our website's podcast where we interview people from various artistic disciplines. These episodes are sometimes full-length interviews from our site's articles and other times exclusives. If you're a returning listener, thanks for coming back. And if you're new here, thanks for checking us out. We hope you'll like it and stick around with us. In this edition of postburnout.com interviews, we speak with James, the mononymous frontman and founder of the Birmingham ambient post-punk band Mutes. James talks to us about starting Mutes as a solo bedroom produced project and then growing it into a full ensemble, their recent 10-year anniversary, their lockdown penned latest single Mere Slaughter and the unfortunate connotations of that title today, their upcoming fourth album, how Mutes compare to James's other bands, and more. I also want to note that this interview was recorded on my end in the middle of Liffey Street in Dublin, and that's because I was outside the Grand Social about to attend a gig, and this interview and that gig kind of coincided, so I had to do the interview. Basically before entering the venue, so you will hear some cars honking, some people talking, the kind of urban din of Dublin. Yeah, unfortunately that's in here, but we hope you don't find it too distracting, and fortunately enough I don't talk that much.
Cool. Lovely.
Yeah, so the first thing I just wanted to ask quite simply was, I believe this is the 10th year of Mutes as a band, is that correct?
Say again. 10
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, as a project, maybe as a full band.
Yeah, no, there's been, many ex-members. But yeah, I guess this is the 10 years since just over 10 years since I put out the first Mutes release. So yeah, 10, which is a bit, depressing to think about, really. But so yeah, it is. Indeed.
What was the kind of impetus, I guess, for starting the project? I mean, what kind of made you want to start?
I think it was one of those, like a lot of people who play in bands. I'd kind of always, ever since I started playing guitar when I was 12. Like the first thing I played my first gig when I was, I think, 13 or 14. We played two songs. One was Teenage Kicks, The Undertones, and the other was a song that I'd written, which was, as an angsty 13-year-old, was called Social Suicide. So I kind of always, from the very start, picking up a guitar, was always interested in making my own songs first and foremost. I was shipped off to boarding school when I was 8 years old, due to learning difficulties and stuff, not behavioral issues. I was always very well behaved. So I never really had the chance when I was at school to start a band. It was only kind of when I went to university, and the university I went to was very much an academic, it was a red brick university, so it wasn't really very arts focused, even though I did English, so I guess that's an arts degree. But my point being that it was very difficult for me at university to form a band with people. It was only really getting out of university that I finally had the chance and the time and stuff to actually get something going. So I think that's why, the first Mutes, Mutes is the sort of, I did have a band at uni, but we only played like 4 shows. So I guess unlike most people that sort of have like a band at college when they're like 15, 16, I never really had the chance. So that's why it's just sort of stayed as this one thing, despite it having lots of members, I guess. So that's the long-winded answer to you. I think, to add a bit of context to that, because it started off as a sort of solo, more kind of bedroom dream poppy thing, I think around that time, around like 2012, bands like groups like Grimes, Wild Nothing, I was really into Panda Bear and stuff, so people that had produce records by themselves in their bedrooms. So they kind of just made me realize that I could do it with just a laptop and a cheap microphone and get going. So that was the sort of impetus for realizing that I didn't have to rely on other people in order to make music, if you know what I mean.
How do you think the actual kind of like production, because you were saying like you started when you were like 12, 13. I actually have two questions kind of related to that. Well, the first was it easy to do kind of like all ages shows as a kid? Like were you able to get shows or was it just kind of like once in a while? And the other question was, how do you feel the technology has developed enough to kind of make what you were doing a possibility, really?
I mean, well, to be fair, like any gigs that I played when I was like under the age of 18 were just like school talent things. They were proper gigs, you know. Like we did like remember once my first ever gig was when I was 13. And I was just like playing guitar for some sixth form guy who was singing. We just like did some Nirvana unplugged covers, and then the next gig I did was the next year when I was 13 or 14, kind of doing full band. So no, I couldn't really, I didn't play any proper gigs until I was 18. In terms of the technology thing, I think obviously, I mean, home recording's always been a thing, but I think it was more the good thing. Why I was very lucky in that, coming of age around sort of 2010, 2011, I think entry level recording equipment had become affordable. When I went to, there's a shop in Birmingham called PMT, which is sort of like a big music sort of store. And I remember I got my student loan in when I was 18, and went there and bought like a microphone for like 75 quid and bought an interface for about 110 quid. So, obviously that was all my money for that term gone in one fell swoop. But I think the good thing now is that a lot of technology that you can use to make music is sort of either ubiquitous enough or seen as essential enough that people have it anyway. Like people can make records on an iPad now, and like I've got a sister who's 11 years younger than me, and she had to have an iPad for school. It was like a requirement. So whereas back in my day, these things that I needed to make music weren't part of the sort of kit list for school. Nowadays, I think anyone with even a passing interest in music probably has, even if they don't know it, some sort of tool at their disposal that they can use. So I guess the bar to entry is a lot lower than it used to be, which is probably why I've got a lot of these sort of kind of SoundCloud rappers and stuff. They're in abundance because everyone has the tools at their disposal, really.
Yeah, and actually, yeah, I think like what's really cool about that is that I noticed that like during the pandemic, a lot of people had to get into production just as a necessity. So you had a lot of people kind of like having growing pains during that period. And I think what's interesting now is that I think being a producer has kind of become somewhat of an extension of the kind of creative arm of music, if you know what I mean. Do you find like, because I talked to some artists and like it used to be, I think like production was sort of seen as like the kind of technical side to get your music actually made. Where I think now, because so many people are self-producing, they kind of realize that like, it is just like, no pun intended, it's instrumental as the music itself. I was wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, I think it also, I mean, it depends what sort of, I guess, artist or songwriter or whatever you are. I mean, I certainly know people who are nearly exclusively into the engineering and production side of things. I certainly know people that are exclusively into the playing their instrument side of things. And then obviously there's the big overlap. But as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think a lot of it comes out of necessity, but also if, unless you're just like a pure sort of dyed in the wool kind of acoustic singer-songwriter, chances are any of the music that you fall in love with, part of that is the way it sounds. And then, because of that, you're going to go and seek why it sounds that way. So for me, as a massive sort of equipment nerd anyway, even when I was, 12 or 13 and the internet was sort of first became accessible to me, even though, I didn't have any money, obviously, I would still like go on guitar shop websites to look at guitars. And there was like a website that listed all of Kurt Cobain's equipment quite comprehensively, and I was obsessed with that. So I think from the start for me, the equipment involved was always kind of intrinsically important to the result of the music. I was into everything. Obviously, it's I was into the lyrics, I was into the artwork, obviously back then. Not to discount, the resurgence in interest in vinyl and stuff, but like back then, getting a CD from like Woolworths for a tenner and having the booklet and stuff like that was a big part of the experience of buying an album, because you couldn't stream it back then, could you? There was, I know this is well trodden ground, but my point being that like being into music then, growing up in that time period, music was as much about these tangible physical things you could get your hand on as it was about the more ethereal, ephemeral nature of the music itself, if you know what I mean. So
yeah, actually, sorry, just I don't mean to interrupt, but also like I'm thinking, like adding on to that, like even now, like when it comes to like live music, for me a huge part of that, like when I was a teenager, when I was a kid, was like the memento of having like the actual ticket with me. Now, like all the tickets are just like PDFs on your phone.
That's a big thing. It's something as well. I mean, like I've got a few tickets still from gigs that I went to, sort of in the past decade. I think I've got, and one thing I do is as well that's sort of similar is whenever we tour, because I've been in quite a few bands, and there's one band in particular I was in that toured quite a lot. And I was actually going through some stuff the other day, and I found all my sort of tour laminates and all access passes and stuff. And yeah, that's definitely something that I guess now with like Dice FM and stuff, that's kind of gone the way of the dinosaurs, isn't it, really? But yeah, I think there are there are other ways to connect to music in that more tangible way, whether it's buying like merch from bands, or and I think it's forced bands to be more creative in what they can offer in that sense. I mean, you see bands offering all sorts now, don't you, from like doing like runs of guitar pedals with companies to limited edition prints. But then there's sort of aside to the merchandise, which is slightly different, because whilst as a fan maybe who's not as clued up on why merchandise exists, it might seem like it's being done so that people have something to remember the band by, but in reality it's done so the band can make money, because we make no money any other way. But yeah,
even then, like now venues are doing like merch cuts and stuff.
Oh yeah, I was reading an article about that yesterday. Yeah. That is something I would say in all honesty that I've actually never come into contact with, merch cuts, but I guess that's because the bands of the level that I have played in have never had any sales worth taking a cut from, you know what I mean?
No, I think that's like, that's kind of the fortunate thing I think about being like one of the smaller acts, that like the venues that kind of like the kind of more DIY or sort of more independent venues, basically the non-sponsored venues, what I'm trying to get at, they kind of they don't really do that, which I think is like nice.
I think it's more the, like you said, the sort of is it DWP? Is that the promoter that owns a lot of venues in Nottingham, like your academies and stuff? I think they're corporate entities, like it shouldn't surprise people that corporations are ruthless. It's how they operate, No,
totally. It's that balance, I think, between like the kind of the commerce side of it, people who are trying to make, who are just trying to monetize everything, like every little detail. Like even now, as we're talking about, like kind of some of the aspects, like now, I don't know if you like notice how much like VIP passes are getting and stuff like that just to meet the act. It's like insane.
Yeah, but then you I mean, not that I'm trying to play devil's advocate or anything like that, but it does have to be bear in mind that as much as musicians, a lot of musicians will try and sort of come in at the angle from like, oh, it's just corporations trying to screw over the little guy. Like these are, these corporations still exist in the same world with rising costs as everyone else. Like I don't think it comes purely from a place of like, oh, here's a way we can screw people over to get some more money. I think there are some cases in which venues have seen, sadly, that it's maybe one of the only ways that they can continue to sustain their operation. And I know that there's some sort of organization who the acronym of the name escapes me now, but it's like independent venue something. But I think a lot of musicians are coming from the angle, well, obviously if these venues are in trouble, that's a problem, but there needs to be a sustainable way of supporting them that doesn't end up basically punching down towards the artist, you know. So either way you cut it, it's a pretty bad scenario. But as I said, thankfully, or you know, not so thankfully, I've yet to reach the level of success rate impacts me. Whatever. Yeah.
So. One thing I want to talk about actually is you were kind of like mentioned we're kind of touching on the trajectory there of like going from kind of self-produced kind of bedroom artist to a full band. And it kind of reminds me, because you were mentioning like Nirvana and Kurt Cobain, like one of their producers, Steve Albini, I mean, that was kind of his trajectory with the band, his first band, Big Black. It went from, you know, producing the Lungs EP in his bedroom to, you know, what Big Black became. And that's like 40 years ago. So, I mean, like you were talking about like the kind of how bedroom production has always been, you know, kind of like, has always kind of been a thing that indie artists have done. I was wondering, do you view Mute and that kind of like lineage, or do you view it kind of, I don't know, detached from that?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously Steve Albini is a huge figure for many reasons in my life, and, you know, Big Black and Shellac and a lot of those, you know, bands from that time period that did a lot of self-recording, you know, Guided by Voices being one of the most sort of quintessential bands in that aspect. And it's and obviously, you know, like Discord, you know, all the bands on that label, a lot of them recorded in the same sort of studio. I guess in terms of Mutes, like the idea of it starting off as a solo thing was never you know, necessarily what I wanted to do. It was just that I couldn't find other people to play with that time period. As it's gone on, it's sort of been a mix of both. I mean, our second album, Paradolia, I did record and mix all that myself. But then after that, it just like recording and engineering is something I'd love to do more of, but it takes time, it takes space. It is another absolute wormhole to go down in terms of like equipment. And if you've already got a bit of a you know, a tendency to get obsessed with the minutiae of things when it comes to equipment, getting into microphones is not something else you want to add to your list. So we'd like it's in terms of recording with I mean, you know, talking about Steve Albini refers to himself as an engineer, doesn't he, rather than a producer, because he just tries to capture a band. And in terms of like this record that we'll be putting out next year, and the one before, and the first record, those 3 records were all recorded with an engineer in a studio. There was never any production involved per se. For example, with this record, we literally set our stuff up. We knew that we wanted to track it live. You know, I rented in some specific microphones that I wanted our engineer to use, and then I actually did all the vocals and keyboards myself at home. So it's kind of become a bit of a mixture of both. Do you know what I mean? Like none of the records we've done have ever been solely recorded by someone else. And in every instance, the production aspects of it has never really existed. But that's not to say that that's necessarily, again, a conscious choice. But, you know, we don't have any money. Every record that we've done in 2 days. I mean, this album that we're putting out now, we literally recorded it all live one day, tracked 13 songs in one day. And the next day I just did the sort of second guitar, and that was it. No more studio time because we don't have any money. So I would love the opportunity to actually go into a studio someone one day and have a producer, you know, have someone else to kind of contribute some creative ideas, because I do think that a lot of bands can end up needing that kind of shot the arm or kick up the arse sometimes. But in reality, when you've got day jobs and families and stuff, I mean, I did do a record. I used to be in a band called Goddamn, and we did a record with a producer named Sylvia Massey, who's worked with like Tool, Johnny Cash, Smashing Pumpkins, Prince. And that was the only time I've ever worked with a proper producer. And to be frank, like that experience was pretty underwhelming, really. She wasn't a producer in the traditional like kind of, oh, I'm going to help you with the arrangement sense or anything. She was very much basically a very expensive engineer. So yeah, my only experience of actually having a proper producer was I don't want to say underwhelming in the sense that, like, you know, it wasn't a great experience. It was, but it wasn't some sort of, you know, we didn't come out of it feeling like creatively, you know, reborn or anything. But but I don't know, it's one of those, isn't it? I mean, I think the next record we do, we've already know who we want to go and record it with and how we want to do it, but that'll be even more stripped back. So yeah, I know, I guess it depends what a band is seeking in terms of the outcome, and if they even want any other creative input, you know. It depends what your aims and goals are, you know, like if you're a band that's trying to make kind of quite potentially commercial pop music, and you know, there's a reason that a lot of these massive pop artists have many songwriters and producers fingerprints over their songs, then yeah, maybe you do need people with more experience that realm to assist you. But if you're basically just an indie band that wants to play some noisy rock songs, I think those talents of these producers and stuff will probably be wasted on you, really, you know. So
yeah. And actually, what's interesting when you kind of like listen to Mute's kind of discography over the last like decades, that I think there is like it started as kind of like more sort of ambient kind of soundscapes, and kind of like sort of transitioned into kind of more raucous kind of post-punk, but then simultaneously, I don't know, I feel you never lost that kind of ambient edge. I feel that's like still kind of present in your music. I was wondering though, like how much of the kind of music that you made with Mutes was kind of based on limitations as a producer, as a musician, and what resource you had, whereas so much of it was kind of deliberate, because I think there's always a give and take between what your equipment is, what your resources are, and what you're actually trying to create, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be like ultimately the output is always going to be dictated by the resources that you've got access to. But I think you sort of learn to work with what you've got in a sense. I mean, the fortunate thing about being into quite a lot of kind of lo-fi or kind of mid-fi artists is that, you know, I've never really fallen in love with like a kind of production style that, you know, I really want to emulate but didn't have the resources to, you know. I mean, the first full band release was an EP called Starvation Age, and at that time I was massively into, there's this sort of scene in Calgary that has bands like Women and Freak Heat Waves. Chad Van Galen's a sort of leading icon in that, and they were basically all about like recording analog and, you know, keeping it quite lo-fi and quite influenced by bands like Swell Maps and like sort of early Syd Barrett. So that worked well because my bandmate at the time had an 8-track Tascam like cassette recording thing in his basement. So I was like, oh, thankfully the only thing I've got access to is the exact kind of thing I want to use anyway. So you kind of learn to temper your expectations really to what your budget is. I mean, it's one of those, I think people have a lot of I think people seem to think that you need access to a lot of resources to make something that sounds polished, but like you know, some of the kind of most successful songs that we've had in terms of like exposure, like, you know, stuff played on like Six Music and stuff, was stuff that I recorded myself, whereas some of the stuff that we spent more money on wasn't picked up. So ultimately, and again, you know, I know I'm treading well charted territory here, but it all depends on as long as the idea comes across, you know, if you've got at least an idea of how to capture it properly, you're probably going to be all right, you know. But then I don't know, you know, as I said, I've never had the luxury of being set loose in a studio with, you know, not a hugely finite amount of time and a hugely finite amount of resources. So, and it would be great if that happened, but it's just no one has the money. You know, you've got to be creative with what you've got, really. And I do find that as well, like, you know, one of the reasons for this sort of lesser inclusion of ambient stuff as time has gone on is not so much because of a conscious decision to move away from that, but because of lineup instabilities in the past, I had more time to sort of do stuff myself, basically just dick about, you know, myself, right, which often would end up in ambient stuff. Whereas now, having had a stable lineup for the past 4 years, I've been able to go into rehearsal space with the same guys every week. And therefore, we've written more stuff as a band and it's become more cohesive that way. But also, B, like in a purely practical sense, like, I mean, you can sort of see probably from like the room's tiny. I can't have my synths and stuff set up the way that I used to and just be able to like walk in after a day at work and be like, oh, I'm just going to make some kind of noise for now. You know, it's now I have to get stuff out of boxes and put it out. So it's literally just a practical sense. I mean, I'd like to do more ambient stuff. I'd like to move away from being so kind of, you know, rock and guitar-y, but it's just that seems to be at the moment the most efficient way we can get ideas down, you know. So right. it might go the opposite direction next time. We'll have to see. It's not never do I sit down and consciously try to create something of a certain style. It's not a pre-thought out thing at all, and it never has been. And we've never really been the kind of band either to exhaustively demo stuff and, you know, tweak it and stuff. It's generally a make it up as we go along. You know, it's really not very thought out at all in that sense. But
the kind of as you were talking about, like the kind of do it cheaply, do it quickly kind of ethos. I mean, it seems like still very punk rock. You mentioned Discord and kind of Inner Ear Studios. I think also of like SST Records with their producer Spot, who would do like Black Flag, Husker Du, Minutemen. I think 16 track, and they would just do it like in 48 hours, and you'd have some great music.
It's one of those. It's, you know, that kind of approach doesn't work for everything and everyone. Absolutely not. But you know, the music that is to me the sort of most exciting is always been the kind of, as you said, like the sort of punk rock kind of post-hardcore stuff, you know, Fugazi, Mission of Burma, Minutemen, you know, earlier Sonic Youth or later Sonic Youth as well, all Sonic Youth. But to me, there's an immediacy there, you know, and there's I was listening to the Wipers the other day, and I was thinking how if you actually obviously, you know, we're talking like early 80s recorded cheaply, but some of these records, like if you were to actually listen to it purely to kind of objectively critique the actual sound of it, you'd be like, well, they sound fucking terrible. It's like, they do, but that is also kind of part of the glue that holds it all together, you know. Like good example being Mission of Burma, like their first EP, Signals, Calls and Marches, was recorded in a studio quite professionally, and they hated the way it sounds. And then if you listen to their full length, you know, the only full length they put out before they broke up, Versus, it's all recorded live. You can hear like stuff happening in the background in the studio, and it's amazing. You know, it doesn't sound technically anywhere near as good, but in terms of the actual energy and its influence, it is infinitely superior. So it just goes to show that, you know, the best technical approach does not always result in the most influential and representative product, you know.
Interesting about Mission of Burma, as you kind of mentioned there, was that actually they would do kind of a lot of the live production, the kind of like backmasking and so on. They would do it from this like live as well, because he'd have the well, actually, another interesting thing about Mission of Burma is I've actually got a guitar lesson with Roger Miller next month. Oh, sick.
It's costing me quite a lot of money, but I know it's getting on a bit, and I saw that he offered on his website, so I was like, I've just got to do it, you know. But yeah, I mean, but again, that aspect of Swope doing all the live tape manipulation, completely, you can't tell at all on that first album. It's just not in there because it was just buried in the mix. But this is another thing as well with those bands. I mean, like a lot of people my age, you know, who are into this kind of music, this band Could Be Your Life was like a very influential book, you know.
I love that book, Michael Azerrad. Yeah,
it's amazing. I've read it a few times, and but you know, the aspect that really comes across as there is just how integral like live performances were, because back then playing live was how you got out there. And there's another band that I play in called Margarita Witch Cult, who are sort of like a kind of stoner rock band, and we're signed to a label based in Europe, and we've been to Europe. I think we've toured there 3 times this year. I mean, I've lost count. But in that scene, like playing live is still the primary way to experience that kind of music. Whereas I feel like with indie rock, especially in the sort of streaming age and the playlisting age, there are a lot of bands that, you know, I'll hear on like Six Music or something, and then they'll be playing like a local venue here, and I'll go and see them, and they just sound rubbish. Not because they're necessarily rubbish bands, but because they haven't spent the amount of time playing together as a unit live as bands used to have to, you know. So there is a bit
I
of
was thinking about that too.
yeah, there's a bit of a lost art to playing live. I think it's something that we've always kind of taken pride in, because for me, still the, you know, the absolute sort of the pinnacle of being a good band is being a good live band. It's
right,
you know, because ultimately there is, you know, God knows how many tens of thousands of songs released a week. You know, as I'm sure you know, as a journalist, it's a very oversaturated market, and you know, it's anyone can just skip a song. You know, and whereas when you see a band with your own eyes, it becomes more of a how can you put it, an unignorable experience. You know,
yeah.
So yeah, that's something, definitely an influence on us from those kind of bands, just realizing that like you can never lose sight of how important it is to play as a live band, you know.
I think an important thing also with them, and just something that Azrad's book talks about too, is actually the network that was set up by the touring acts, where I think it was like Black Flag were kind of like are seen as the kind of like one of the first bands to really start doing like national tours in the kind of DIY sense. And they would kind of find the venues and share the venues with other people and so on. And those networks still exist. You mentioned touring Europe, and what I always really liked about the European scene was that they just got these like old like youth centers that were made by the governments, like in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and so on, and just like converted them into like really sick music venues, like the Arena in Vienna. It's probably the most noteworthy example. And they still exist to this day. I mean, like some of them have actually kind of turned, like the Arena have actually turned quite professional. They've somewhat commercial, I guess.
There's all sorts of odd venues. I did a tour in Europe with Goddamn in 2017, and at least two of the venues used to be prisons. And you know, the first one, you're like, oh, this is odd. And then, you know, there was another one as well. So yeah, I think on the continent, you know, cause when I first toured Europe in 2017, obviously that was pre-Brexit, and because I was younger, and because it wasn't a headline tour, we were a support band on the tour, maybe my eyes weren't so open to how just differently people digest live music over there. But I definitely think there was a huge emphasis on the importance of like physical product over there. Like we shift so much merchandise out there when I'm with Margarita Witchcult. And the sort of the further enthusiasm of gig goers there is really like it's a completely different world to the UK. You know, you can play, audiences in Britain will just stand there stroking their chins, which is fine. I'm not suggesting that people have to be headbanging to be enjoying it or anything. There's definitely a real hunger over there for the live music experience. But I think, you know, not to sort of over intellectualize or anything, but a lot of it also comes down to you know, the difference in the quality of life and the cost of living. You know, I know that there's probably not that many places in the sort of developed world that are cheap to live in, but I think in the UK, especially, you know, post-COVID, with living costs as they are, I think people maybe don't enjoy live music as much, simply because making the decision to go to a gig is now a far more impactful decision on your finances and stuff than it used to be, you know. So maybe people's enthusiasm has been dampened a bit in that sense. But it all depends, you know. Sometimes you get a nice little surprise somewhere.
I'm over in Ireland, and I know that that's the issue here too, where, you know, it's a weird thing where venue costs, you know, are relatively high. Yeah, you also have to kind of keep like ticket prices at a low enough gig, so it's very difficult to even break even, let alone make a surplus. It's just like almost impossible.
Yeah, the amount of people, you know, in the music industry who just jacked it in during COVID, you know, it's because of that very reason, and it's sad, but it's also, it kind of goes back to, as far as mutes are concerned, like, although obviously, as I just said, like we've always placed huge importance on being a live band. When we couldn't play live, it wasn't a case of like, oh God, what are we going to do? Oh, now our enthusiasm's gone because I didn't enjoy the gigging. We were just like, all right, well, we'll just write and send stuff each other ideas. Like, any way that it was going to happen, whether live music was going to come back again, it was going to come back differently or whatever. That was never a case of it, that might like break up the band or anything, because either way, like we all happen to like writing and recording music as much as we do performing it. So whereas I think some bands are maybe, like these stoner rock bands, for example, that like are in the scene that Margarita Witchcult are in, without that live experience, I imagine there's nowhere near as much enjoyment being in a band, because that is a huge part of that, so yeah, it's about adaptability, I think, and this goes to the venues as well, and the promoters and everyone. It's all about adaptability. I mean, I know it's I'm not suggesting that people should just shut up and put up, but we've always lived in interesting times, as they say. There's always been new challenges. So I know everyone's trying to say like, oh yeah, musicians are getting screwed so much now. Like, Spotify's just confirmed that they will be ceasing all royalty payments for songs that get less than 1,000 streams a year. And people are kicking off about that, saying that, oh, this is just another way for them to screw artists. But like, A, if your song's getting less than 1,000 plays a year, you ain't earning jack shit from it anyway. And B, it's like, yeah, it sucks, but there are other ways that you can monetize your band's music. Like, bands are welcome to boycott Spotify if they really wish. They're welcome to just use Bandcamp and other streaming services that maybe have a more ethical way of paying out. But ultimately, the reality that we're living in is that Spotify is, for better or for worse, the most consumed way of getting music. And in terms of industry, it presents the numbers that people give the most importance in terms of streaming figures. It just is what it is. If you don't want to play that game, you don't have to. But moaning about it is really, if time's told anything, gonna cause very little to change. Ultimately, it's just how it is. There's always going to be some evil overlord, whether it's Spotify or the next thing or whoever it was before, like home tape and killer music sort of thing, so sure. You just have to adapt to it, really. But then I know that that's easy for me to say because I don't actually make my living from playing music, so I do appreciate that those that do, it probably impacts more, but that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, to go back to kind of what you're saying about, like, yeah, but I think like people who are earning less than 1,000 probably aren't doing it for a living, or if it is, they probably like, sorry, by doing it for a living, I mean being a musician for a living, or if they are, they're probably like session musicians or something. That's how they pay the bills. So yeah, I mean, I understand. Like, I mean, I think really you have to kind of be getting like millions of streams a year really to even break even.
Yeah, to even get any real money from it. And it's I think people's issues that is mainly they're like, well, if they're not paying out the royalties for those streams, are they just pocketing it for themselves? That's kind of the main issue, I suppose. But again, it's like, well, yeah, maybe, but they're a business. It's what businesses do. They try and make money. So you can't really bitch and moan about it too much,
Then also I was thinking, like, you kind of have to have the established fan base and the kind of capital to be able to counter it. I think of people like Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, even Steve Albini himself actually pulling their stuff from Spotify for ethical concerns. And it's like, you guys can afford to do that, more power to you. But like for an up and coming band to not be on Spotify seems to be, sorry, just the traffic on by. To not be on Spotify seems to be, I don't know, kind of like a death toll in a way.
But yeah, you'd be shooting yourself in the foot. It's but there's a again, without going sort of too kind of political or anything, like there are a lot of things that bands can do to try and make themselves seem aligned with a certain political stance or something, and bands are perfectly free and able to do whatever they like. If a band wants to, for example, put its music from Spotify because they think that it's giving a platform to people who espouse views that they don't share. In the case of Neil Young, basically what he saw as Joe Rogan having a massive platform and spreading misinformation about COVID. Then, yeah, bands are welcome to pull their music from Spotify if they feel that makes them feel like they're on the sort of perceived right side of history. Then they're free to do that. But like this idea of like, oh well, smaller bands can't really afford not to have their music on Spotify. Like, no one puts a gun to your head and says you must now form a band, write, record music, and then release it to the world. It's entirely personal choice. So it's the way that I see it is like, unless you've actually signed a contract and you are employed in this industry and therefore you have to operate within it, and you can't just sort of afford to throw away your source of income. In terms of smaller bands, like, they are absolutely free not to buy into this sort of capitalistic system that bands exist in if they do not want to. I mean, we see it in Birmingham. There's a lot of hardcore bands at the moment, and a lot of them don't even like record music. They just play live, and they play all ages shows, and they do a lot of shows for charity and stuff, and they have no interest in existing within the capitalist structure of the music industry. But when indie bands sort of bitch and moan about it, and all I think is like, well, if you hate it that much, like, no one is forcing you to do it. You can still write and record songs and put them out yourself, but by engaging in it, like, that's seeming to indicate that you do want to go somewhere within the industry. So it's sort of a bit hypocritical, that's the way that I see it. But I'm sure some people would say that that's not a very nuanced view, but that's how I feel about it. So
no, that's totally fair. I guess the final thing I'll just ask quite simply is, like, your upcoming album is coming out next year. It's called Mere Slaughter. The title track for the album was released, I think, last week, right? So
it's the album's called. The album title hasn't actually been announced yet.
Oh, okay. I was told that.
The album's coming out next year, but the details of the actual album will probably be confirmed with the release of the next single. But yeah, Mere Slaughter is the new single, which is the first thing we've released from it. Yeah.
Okay. And then just talking about, like, so as I was saying, like, I think with your music, it's very difficult to predict what's coming next in a good way. I was wondering, like, do you find, because this single has a very, like, haunting, almost hypnotic, I felt kind of like that would be the word I'd use to describe it. It felt very, like, I don't know, very hypnotic. In some ways, again, not to get too political, but it kind of has a bit of what do you call it, a bit of I don't know, a bit of relevancy now with what's going on in the world.
Yeah, we were speaking about it the other day. Yeah. So my question is just quite simply, I mean, do you find that this single is kind of indicative of what the album as a whole is going to sound like, or do you think this is it's more like case by case? So yeah, well, 2 points in that I've got. Firstly, no, it's not at all indicative of how the album is going to sound. The album is absolutely all over the place. There is still ambient stuff on it. There's stuff that is potentially poppier than we've ever done. There's stuff that is definitely more maybe is going to take a few repeated listens to get into. The album as a whole is we've always sort of, our variety has been pointed out in the past as almost being to our detriment, in that we're quite a hard band to categorize. But I think with this album, it's definitely the one that, although I'm obviously we're all very happy with it, I definitely think it isn't necessarily one that's going to sink in all at once. I think it does bear repeat listens. Mere Slaughter, one of the reasons that we have put it out as a first single is because that sort of hypnotic aspect you described, because of the repetition and stuff. It is quite, but I don't think if it's the song that you put on, you could ignore it, and that isn't just because it's like noisy, but I think there is a kind of hookiness to it that belies its, the heaviness of it belies the actual hookiness of it. Do you know what I mean? Like, it is actually a catchy song, even if it is quite raw around the edges. But to digress slightly, but also refer back to your point about it sadly being relevant at the moment. It was actually, I actually wrote it during lockdown. I was a key worker, and I still had to go into the office every day in lockdown because I managed an apartment building. And obviously managing an apartment building that's on lockdown, and then all your tenants are in the building going mental, it was all quite mad. So I think it wasn't necessarily written as a kind of response to what I saw as, the Tories' sort of mishandling of the COVID situation. Although that probably was the jumping off point for it. But obviously, the last thing I'd ever have wanted would be for it to be as equally relevant right now. But we were talking about this the other day. We were just saying that, like, the sad fact of the matter is that themes of that nature are probably sadly always going to be relevant, so that's not, I'm not proud in any way for it to have been foreshadowing or anything like that, but that is the reality of it, so that's another long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's totally fair. I think I've asked everything I have to ask. It was really nice talking with you. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up? Or?
No, not really. I mean, just the usual kind of bullshit spiel of, like, big things coming, blah 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 blah. But no, I mean, like I said, obviously, details of the album will be, in terms of the release date and stuff, will be forthcoming, probably around February. And if anyone wants to keep up to date with what we do, then you can find us on the internet. And just thank you very much for your time. It's really nice speaking to you.
Absolutely. Hopefully we do it again.
Yeah, man. Well, thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely evening.
You too. Take care.
All right. See you in a bit, man. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to that episode of postburnout.com interviews. If you liked it, please subscribe and stick around, because we have plenty more like this coming soon.